The Ulrike Kingdom's coalition has successfully sent a probe to Minmus and back. Now this was huge news, a smaller country outdoing its larger competitors, building a low-tech, low-cost, low-maintenance, flimsy rocket, and making it all the way to Minmus and back gained them enormous amounts of science, reputation, and pride. The UKC was quickly becoming the underdog that everyone was cheering for. In response to this, the AMS and the URA needed to somehow make the Ulrike nation's achievements look small. They would do this by sending a ship to the moon that was comprised of both URA and AMS crew members. Once at the moon, they would collect the data from not only one, but two different probes before returning back to Kerbin. These probes were separated by a long distance and would therefore test the capabilities of the spacecraft to its limit. By comparison, a long-duration, high-risk mission with an international crew made the Minmus probe look meager at best.
All systems green. Both spacecraft look good. Copy that, Eagle 2.
The separations look good. We are on final approach.
So far, the mission had gone textbook, but the Kerbinauts were a little worried. That second probe was really far away. They would have to burn just right to get to that second probe in order to have enough fuel to make it back to Kerbin. In other words, their margin for error was microscopic. If successful, this will be the very first time a spacecraft has landed on multiple biomes and then returned safely back to Kerbin. However, Mission Control was not going to force them to make that final risky decision. If the Kerbinauts thought that they did not have enough fuel to make it to the second probe, they could simply return back to Kerbin. The choice was theirs.
Ready to make history?
Maria, I was born for this.
Full power in 3, 2, 1.
With only 1/4 of their fuel remaining, Mission Control was worried about their chances of making it back. While Control started looking at different types of rescue plans, they reluctantly gave the order to the Kerbinauts to make the return trip home, albeit carefully.
Control to Eagle 2, your margin for error is 0 tolerance. I repeat, 0 tolerance.
Copy, Control.
Luckily, with almost no fuel remaining, they were able to set a flight path back to Kerbin. The boys back at Mission Control could breathe again, and everything seemed to be working just fine. However, space travel is not that easy.
Eagle 2 to Mission Control. Are you reading this?
That's affirmative, Eagle 2. We got our guys looking at it right now. Could be a possible glitch.
That's not a glitch. I ran the numbers on it 3 times already. Please advise.
Stand by, Eagle. Just stand by.
Unbelievably, their navigational computer had calculated their angle of re-entry wrong. Instead of their periapsis being at a nice cushy 55,000 meters, they would be slamming into Kerbin's atmosphere at nearly 40,000 meters high at over 3,000 meters per second. As the crew tried to use what pinch of fuel they had to correct it, it was already too late. The ship had never been tested with this kind of thermal extreme. No one really knew what was going to happen. The only thing the crew could do was make peace with themselves and pray.
Chris, it's been truly an honor.
The honor was mine. Zenit. Godspeed, Eagle 2. Radio blackout in 3, 2, 1. Eagle 2, come in, Eagle 2. Command, Eagle 2. Please respond. Primary chutes just auto-deployed flight. Still no response from crew. Eagle 2 to command. This is Christoph Kerman, second command. The crew accounted for. Commander Zenit is waking up from her nap. Damn, it's good to hear your voice, Commander. Okay, choppers are inbound. ETA, 10 minutes.
Amazingly, the Eagle 2 ship and her crew survived the extreme re-entry. If this mission hadn't already captured the attention of all of Kerbin, it was now on the front page of every newspaper around the world. It seemed as though everyone had forgotten about the little probe that went to Minmus and back, but the Ulrite kingdoms were going to change that. It was time to remind the world that this underdog was not going to go down without a fight. By order of the United Nations, the larger nations had to go ahead and share their technologies with smaller nations. However, there was no law or rule stating that they had to share their designs with smaller nations. So smaller nations like the Ulrite Kingdom's coalition had to build, well, what they could from scratch. In many cases, the rockets were flimsy at best. And sadly, most of the time they were plagued by software bugs and glitches. Now, the Minmus probe was built in haste, and unfortunately, the Ulrike engineers and scientists forgot to put on solar panels. During the mission, however, they tried to go around this by turning off certain batteries in hopes to turn them back on once they got to Minmus. However, the batteries failed to turn back on. No matter how many times they tried, it would simply not respond to commands. The UKC would watch with heavy hearts as the attempt to recapture the world's attention and support was slipping through their fingers. Back at the research facilities of the URA and AMS, they were already reaping the benefits brought back from their previous moon mission. With science set to 10%, it became clear that they had to choose very carefully on what the next technology was to research and unlock. This was going to be, of course, docking. If they were going to go anywhere in space, they needed a way to refuel in orbit so that they didn't have to launch a big giant spacecraft in orbit. They could launch smaller ones and put them together. As the UKC was still licking its wounds with its recent spacecraft disaster, the URA and AMS joined together to be the first nations to dock in space. Because of the high-risk nature of this mission, no Kerbals would be allowed to be inside these spacecrafts. Everything would be remote controlled. No one knew if it was even possible to dock without some sort of maneuvering thruster capability, but they were going to try.
4, 3, 2, main engine start. We have liftoff. Booster separation looks good. Nose cone separation looks good. All systems nominal. Final stage separation complete. Craft is now commencing orbital insertion burn. Вверх. До. Не. Ограничение наверх. Оставить не изменит.
So far, so good. Rendezvous were going according to plan. However, they would be on the night side of Kerbin. So now not only had docking never been attempted before, but now it was going to be done in almost total darkness. Needless to say, mission control was on edge.
Confirmed. Docking is green. We have hard lock. I repeat, we have hard lock.
Amazingly, both spacecrafts not only rendezvoused, but docked on the night side of Kerbin. The ability to dock meant that space stations could be constructed. Larger, more powerful vessels could be built. This would mark a new era in Kerbal Kind's reach for the stars. In order to save face, the UKC offered its assistance in building any future space stations or spaceships that the larger, more powerful nations wanted to put up there. Because of this, all three nations were now united under one common goal, and from this union, Kerbin's first International Space Station would be built.